Welcome to The Exchange. I'm your host, Rob Cox. Today we're talking to New Yorker journalist Nick Poundgarten about the business of the dead, the Grateful Dead, that is. Nick, thanks for coming on. Loved your piece in The New Yorker about the Grateful Dead. And I was really struck by some of the things that you touched on, which really talk about, in a sense, the sort of business of music and how the Grateful Dead, without perhaps knowing it, set this legacy that is, it's kind of like where musicians have to go today.
Yeah, it's true. The business model for music today is really a model that they pioneered, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago. I mean, they did it without knowing it. Yeah. As Phil Lesh says in the piece, we bass-ackwards into everything. I mean, they had no plan.
Right.
But they toured to make money. They tried to make...
It was all touring. Right. It was never about really selling records for their success.
They tried to make albums that sold. They tried to make hits. The harder they tried, the worse they got at it. And later on, they did figure it out.
Right.
And then they became a bigger touring act. But really, yeah, they were one of the biggest grossing touring acts of the whole rock and roll era.
But it's funny, like, you know, now in the post-record era, as it were, bands, particularly indie rock bands, people like that, have really got to get out and about. They've got to do festivals, they've got to tour. If it's not about selling, you know, multi-platinum records.
Right.
And it's funny that the Grateful Dead really, I mean, through the period of their greatest success as a touring act, coincided with the basic boom of the record business.
That's right. Well, they like to play music on stage. They were better at that than they were playing it in the studio. So it just kind of worked out that way.
Right.
But it is true that because of that, they built this recorded legacy of thousands of tapes of concerts that were traded and curated and judged, you know, thumbs up, thumbs downs by people, which kept people interested.
Yeah.
And as a result, this music has lived on past the band's touring days by decades.
Right. I mean, in a sense, it's sort of, you know, it's like viral marketing, right? Of course, there was probably nobody sitting there with Jerry saying, "Oh, we need to come up with a viral marketing plan." But at the same time, letting people record and pass and not sell, but pass them around, right? Trade these things like currency at a Dead show. Right. You could buy, I don't know, acid or a T-shirt with a tape. I mean, it's sort of really about the viral marketing that bands have to pursue today.
It's true. I mean, sometimes they objected to the taping, sometimes they didn't.
Right.
But they began to realize as time went by that this was building an audience rather than killing an audience.
Right.
And it worked out for them.
Among Deadheads, and I assume you were one of them,
yes.
There is a
Deadhead.
there is a view that of certain shows are like the epic shows, the pinnacle of their achievement. Yeah. It's funny, one of the things you point out was this Barton Hall show, May '77 at Cornell University,
yes.
has never actually been released by the band.
It's never been released. They don't even have it in the vault.
Right.
Which is where they keep their music.
Yeah, what is the vault?
The vault is where they keep all the recordings, the original recordings of their concerts, of their recording sessions, and it's a sort of famed amber room of Grateful Dead lore.
Where is that?
So right now it's in Burbank, California.
Oh, it's
but
Warner.
It used to be in San Francisco, but you know they sold the licensing rights to Rhino, and Rhino is part of Warner, and so now it's part of this big Warner
vault. So did you
vault.
go into the vault?
I went into the vault.
What was that?
I mean, the coolest thing in some ways of going into the vault was actually not the Grateful Dead stuff, but it was all the other stuff that Warner Brothers has.
Oh, really?
I mean, they have you know, unreleased material by all these bands, and in fact, in fact-checking the story, you know, that kicked up a big fuss because Warner Brothers has all this stuff, wants to do stuff with it, but you know, because of the legal entanglements with each artist, you know, it's hard for them to release stuff. Meanwhile, the Dead, because of the way they were set up, they've been releasing the stuff for years.
Right.
They've been releasing it, you know, as commercial product, but also as traded free product. You know, it's all out there.
Right.
So their vault is actually the most porous vault of them all, even though it has this reputation as being this sort of the vault.
Yeah,
it's actually the least vaultish of all vaults.
Interesting. The most porous of the vaults.
Yes.
Community. This is another big thing. I mean, I went to Grateful Dead shows in the '80s, and I remember, you know, it was a community.
I saw you there, man.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I remember seeing you there. But no, one of the things that, you know, you see now, bands use Facebook, they use Twitter, but there's this, it's all about cultivating that community, making sure that your loyal followers get their tickets and that kind of thing. The Dead were way ahead on that, weren't they?
Yeah, they had the mail order program for getting tickets out there. I mean, the parking lot was a kind of Facebook in a way. I mean, people would go there, and some people wouldn't even go into the concerts. Just want to hang out with their friends. Yeah, it was grim. It got kind of grim, and it actually it fell in on itself and helped destroy the experience for the band. So that by the end, they couldn't go anywhere except for these big stadiums. But for a while, it was a bit of an Eden. And it helped build, it built an audience and sustained an audience.
But it also created this sort of jam band culture, I would argue, you know, so Phish.
Better or worse,
for better or for worse. But it did create that sort of notion of you follow the band and you have the whole Phish head scene or whatever it is. And that's still pretty much alive. Again, it's still part of the really the way bands function today.
Well, it started out by being a band that would play differently every night, at least in theory.
Right.
For them, it was hot and cold. You know, they'd play well or not, but they'd play differently every night. And I think,
And you didn't know what this was going to be.
And
You
it-
eagerly anticipated
Right.
what might be on there.
and that air of expectation created tension. And I think all the other bands have done that. And as a result, people are interested in going more than once.
What kind of response have you gotten from people, deadheads or not?
I've heard from a lot of deadheads, who are mostly pleased.
Right.
I've heard from some Dead haters that I've known for years that are just kind of amazed that they got through a story about the Grateful Dead, and even some of them even admit to enjoying it.
They just thought you were glorifying the Grateful Dead.
No, you know, the piece does some work on trying to say, look, the Dead were obnoxious, the fans, Deadheads are obnoxious, the music was sloppy.
Two or three chords that went on for 20 minutes
Yeah,
with a lot of
sometimes it was a
noodling.
dirge,
Yeah.
sometimes it was aimless, their singing was bad, their sense of time was occasionally sloppy. You know, it admits to all their faults. And I think that maybe lured in some readers that have said, yeah, I agree with that. So,
Right.
So what are you going to say that's positive about this experience?
And of course, the Deadheads didn't like you saying that.
There's a portion of Deadheads that the Dead can do no wrong.
Now,
and they
what about-
cheered every
Oh, of
blown
course.
note.
Yeah.
You know, which got obnoxious too. I mean, I hated being around that scene after a while.
I've heard a criticism about Phil Lesh, who seems to have been sort of, in some ways, the brains behind some of the decisions that the band made.
Yes.
After Jerry Garcia's death.
He was discriminating, yeah.
You're right, right. There was a sense I heard that, well, because he sold the licensing rights to Rhino, as you mentioned, part of Warner Music, he sold out.
Yeah, I mean, the music's still there, number
Yeah.
one. Number two, these guys have to make a living as, you know, they're in their 70s now, and they were supporting, you know, when Jerry Garcia was alive, they supported a huge operation. You know? It almost choked them. Garcia dies, they lose the touring revenue, which means they're basically a company that now has no revenue or very little revenue. I think they probably realized that it made more sense for them to pare it down, give the admin to another company, and just play the music and not worry about any of the other stuff. And I think they seem liberated by it.
You know what's funny is the financial community, which there's a huge following among the Grateful Dead. I remember, I was telling you before, when I worked at Bloomberg and someone had put the obit on the wire, it shut down the entire system because everybody in the financial community went and pressed it. I mean, do you get a sense that there's a lot of closet deadheadery?
Yeah, well, there's an old saying among Deadheads, which I've recently, it's "We are everywhere," and I recently found out it comes from the gay community in the 60s.
Right.
I wasn't aware of that because I've been saying it for years. Yeah, they're in all walks of life. I mean, I've been saying, I know 5 neurosurgeons or neurologists, which is an interesting thing in itself.
Right.
They're all Deadheads, you know, and I don't know them because they listen to the Grateful Dead, but they just, you know, those are not your typical parking lot habitués. you
Right,
know?
right. Thank you very much for coming on, Nick. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Rob Cox. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon for another episode of The Exchange.